Awesemo MLB Strategy Show, sponsored by PrizePicks today. Guys, if you have not tried out PrizePicks, head on over to PrizePicks.com. Use the promo code Awesemo and get a $100 match on the first deposit that you put down. Adam, we've got 14 games to talk about today, monster MLB slate. So I kind of just want to get into the games, but first, any just overarching or general thoughts you have on this particular slate and all the games on it?
No, not really. I mean, just in general with 14 game slates, obviously raw ownership comes down on most plays. So maybe not quite as important, especially like leveraging against popular plays typically isn't quite as useful, I don't think, as it is on like those 4 and 5 game slates, but nothing really specific to this slate.
Yeah. And then, to your point also, you look at some of the ownership projections for today, yesterday's slate, we end up having Corbin Burns over 50% rostered on DraftKings. He crushed. Jacob deGrom got off to a rocky start. Maybe some people who sell lineups on Twitter jumped the gun a little bit and were bragging that they faded Jacob deGrom only from the strikeout like 14 of the next 18 hitters that he faced. But yeah, and then there's nothing really like that in terms of ownership today. Just to give away some of the data we have on the site right now, the most popular pitcher on DraftKings as of now is Max Scherzer, project for 26% ownership. A little bit of ownership on the offense going to Coors Field, but nothing crazy. More often than not on these big slates, I don't weigh ownership as much. It's just kind of, who are the spots that we project to be the best scoring pitchers, who are the offenses that have the best odds of being a top stack. Because, some of the individual spots, there's generally not too much crazy ownership. Starting right here, though, a game that right off the bat, I don't have a massive amount of interest in. Milwaukee Brewers playing against the Pittsburgh Pirates, Adrian Hauser versus JT Brubaker. That is the pitching matchup. I have rostered Brubaker a little bit this season. However, a lot of times it's been on smaller slates or just slates where he was, like 5,800 or something like that. FanDuel single pitcher slate, no reason to really consider him. 7,000 on DraftKings. I think you could make a case for him. But with that said, in the initial build I made this morning, I'm not really getting that much of him. Specifically, the main reason because he's kind of in the same price range as Sonny Gray. So any interest in the pitchers on either side here?
Not a ton. Brubaker, you're getting 80 to 90 pitches typically when he pitches well. Strikeout stuff's decent, around 23% for the season. Milwaukee with a relatively low implied run total at 3.9. So I could see him landing in some lineups just if you need 7K for a pitcher, but I don't think it's anybody I'm going out of my way to target. On the other side with Adrian Hauser, not the most favorable price tag for a guy with a strikeout percentage around 20%. The Pirates, are a very good matchup. The park is good, but I don't really see myself paying 8,300 for Adrian Hauser here.
Yeah, the problem, it's a big site. It's a big slate. There's a lot of teams to target, a lot of pitchers, a lot of upside pitchers. And then, for DraftKings purposes, like I said, a lot of this is going to revolve around Sonny Gray coming off the injured list and being massively underpriced. He becomes such a high priority for me as long as we find out he doesn't have any, severe pitch limitations, that I'm going to like him way more than any other pitcher in that kind of range. As for the offenses in this spot, once again, the pitchers aren't great fantasy options, but, the Brewers, we have with a 2.2% chance being the top stack on the slate. The Pittsburgh Pirates, they have the lowest stack odds in terms of anybody on the entire slate, less than 1% chance being the top scoring team. So I don't really think these offenses are ones I want to target either.
Yeah, it looks the same way to me. Milwaukee is projected to be under-owned, but still only about a 2% chance of being the top scoring stack on the slate. So they're a team where if you're playing 150 lineups, I can see having some exposure, but not getting carried away here. One of the lowest totals on the game overall, not favorable hitting conditions, not a favorable park, 2 pitchers that are relatively decent. Just not too interested in this game overall.
Yeah, that's how I feel also. It's one that could just, knock it off the list and move on. We got a lot of games to talk about. Los Angeles Dodgers at the Washington Nationals. This is a game that does become pretty important because 2 marquee pitchers on the slate. Max Scherzer against Julio Urias. Mentioned before at the top of the show, Max Scherzer currently projected for the most ownership of any pitcher on DraftKings. On FanDuel, though, a little more contrarian of an option, priced up to $11,000, the most expensive pitcher by a pretty wide margin. Only 5.5% projected ownership on Max Scherzer. With that in mind, I think he becomes a very, very strong GPP play on FanDuel. For DraftKings purposes, I also like getting to him overweight to the field at the 26 number. Tough matchup against the Dodgers. However, Scherzer's still a really strong pitcher, and even with the change in the foreign substance enforcement for pitchers, Scherzer still looked really good in his last couple outings. So if I'm paying up for any pitcher on the slate, Scherzer's number 1 for me. Is it the same for you?
Yeah. There are a couple things that concern me. Obviously Max Scherzer is great. The strikeout stuff, he leads the slate with a 35.5% strikeout percentage. The matchup against the Dodgers certainly isn't easy, so that's an obvious concern. But also, it hasn't been reflected so far in his called strike or called plus swinging strike percentage. But out of all 165 starting pitchers that I pulled data for since they started enforcing the rule on sticky stuff, Scherzer has the ninth highest drop in total spin rate. His fastball spin rate's down. His breaking ball spin rate is way down. So it hasn't really been reflected too much in his results yet, but I do have some concerns there that maybe we see Scherzer struggle a little bit more than normal going forward. I still think he's a very good play, especially at 10-5 on DraftKings, but there is, I think, some reason for, I guess, pessimism about him going forward.
So I'll ask you then, because I know you do play a lot of cash on DraftKings for baseball, with Scherzer projected to be, fairly popular, but the ownership at pitcher is still pretty flat. Scherzer, Lance Lynn, Sonny Gray, these guys are all about the same in terms of projected ownership. Is Scherzer still a high priority cash play for you, or would you rather get to guys like Lance Lynn and Sonny Gray?
Yeah, I still think he's a high priority cash play, because I think in cash games, you're not really looking to take those sort of narrative based or speculation based stands like you are in tournaments. So I'm more inclined than cash to just, go with projections and go with, because you're just kind of trying to get the most likely outcome. The most likely outcome is Max Scherzer still very good. In tournaments is where I'd be a little bit more interested in maybe like going some other routes and hoping that maybe the spin rate does affect him negatively. But in cash games where, you're basically just trying to beat 50% of the field or whatever, depending on what you're playing. But in general, 55% of the field, I think you're better off just assuming Max Scherzer is still going to be a very, very good pitcher.
So then on the other side, Julio Urias, is he potentially one of the pitchers that you'd be looking to pivot off of Max Scherzer with? Because Urias, even though I said, I don't consider ownership a ton on slates this large, Urias is only projected for 3% ownership, and that's certainly a number that I think warrants being overweight to the field on. Urias's numbers since the foreign substance crackdown, he's had a whole bag of mixed results, although there hasn't been anything I've seen super alarming in his spin rate. Maybe I didn't look at the data for his last start, so maybe there's something different that was more telling there. But overall, the numbers for Urias this year, 3.95 ERA, 3.71 expected ERA, 28.4% strikeout rate. That's a career high. Urias was once a former top prospect in baseball. It feels like he's been around forever. He's had surgeries. He's been in the big league since 2016. But even with that said, he's still only 24 years old. He's still improving. And, the results have been pretty solid this year. For tournaments, do you think he's somebody worth looking at?
Yeah, I think as long as the ownership stays low, he's worth looking at, because, again, we talked about there not being 50% on guys, but you're still getting like 10-1 on Julio Urias versus like Lance Lynn, for example, right now. And the biggest concern, I think, on Urias is that he typically doesn't go deep into games, at least as far as pitch count goes. He's going to give you like 80 to 90 pitches normally, but the strikeout stuff's very good with a 28% strikeout percentage, only has about a 4.5% walk percentage, which helps to mitigate those pitch count concerns, because he's not walking guys. He's not going as deep in the counts on those guys. And, again, the ownership is really, really low. He's not that expensive at 9,200. So not someone I would be looking to in cash games, but I think in tournaments, he does work out as, a player you can use, especially if you have a more popular stack or more popular hitters in general in your lineup.
And then just one final question before we move on. Given some of the concerns you highlighted with some of the spin rate and potential drop in stuff for Max Scherzer going forward, any reason for you to consider maybe if you were playing 150 lineups to make a couple of Dodger stacks?
Yeah, I think so, for a couple of reasons. For one, there are those relatively minor, but the concerns that I have with Scherzer. But also, I mean, the Dodgers are just a team where when they're not going to get ownership, I think like when you talk about teams like the Dodgers, the Yankees, like these teams that just have so much power in their lineup, basically, I think over the course of an entire season, if you were to just stack them every time they're low owned and ignore, what pitcher they're facing, you're probably coming out ahead in these top heavy tournaments, because there's just so much power upside from these guys. Even the best pitchers in baseball have some off games, relatively few, but it happens. And they do have a 4.2 implied run total, which isn't very high, but it's pretty high for a Max Scherzer opponent. So I do have interest in the Dodgers here. Of course, not a high probability play, but getting about 2% aggregate ownership on a team that has Mookie Betts, Muncy, Turner, Bellinger, Will Smith, Taylor, like so much power in this lineup.
And it's funny you bring up the Yankees here, because I don't think you did it intentionally, but it's a perfect segue, because the next matchup.
No, I did it intentionally. I'm a pro.
There we go. Listen, that's the radio master. Radio master, Shit My Money DFS and Adam Scherer over here. Next game we have to talk about The Yankees in that same exact kind of spot that you just highlighted. Yankees going up against Taijuan Walker. Walker has pitched well this year, although if you look at his numbers, reason to think that he's maybe been a little bit lucky. He's a 2.38 ERA. Obviously, that's great. 3.63 expected ERA. Still very good, but still due for a little bit of regression here when you look at the underlying numbers, also a 3.75 xFIP. The main reason is that Taijuan Walker this year, 260 BABIP, also a strand rate of nearly 80%. Both numbers that I don't really think are sustainable going forward. So while in his own right, Taijuan Walker has pitched well this year, the Yankees as a stack, nobody's rostering them. So they actually are one of the teams with one of the top leverage scores in our top stacks tool. So is this a spot that you would be willing to get to the Yankees, kind of like you alluded to before?
Yeah, same type of spot. I think Taijuan Walker's good. He's certainly not as scary as Max Scherzer is to take hitters against. And like you said, he's been good this year, but there are some things in his underlying numbers that suggest he's been pretty lucky in some areas. Against right-handed bats in particular, he's only allowed a .097 ISO, but his expected ISO is 167, which still not very high, but it's giving up some power to righties. Only has a 23.5% strikeout rate against righties this year compared to 29.1% against lefties. That's something that always kind of interests me when you're getting a pitcher going up against a right-handed heavy lineup that has a lot of power. He's not missing as many bats against righties, and that plays to the strengths of guys like Judge, Sanchez, and Giancarlo Stanton. So the Yankees are very expensive. I think that's probably one reason they're not getting ownership, along with the fact that Walker is decent. But it's a spot in tournaments where I think paying up to be contrarian for a team with as much power as the Yankees have makes a lot of sense, especially on a 14-game slate. This is one spot where I think maybe strategy can change a little bit in those larger field tournaments. On smaller slates, there's only so many cheap pitchers that you can look to. On these bigger slates, just because of the number of options, there's going to be cheap guys that have good games, much better games than we're expecting. Of course, getting the right one is difficult, and kind of have to get lucky sometimes, but like the point is there's going to be cheap pitchers that do well on this slate. So it makes it a little bit easier from just like an overall strategy sense to employ a strategy where you're just kind of using some of the cheap pitchers and paying up for the best bats.
All right. And on the other side, Jordan Montgomery going up against the Mets. Another spot. Not really a lot of interest in Jordan Montgomery for me as a pitcher. No interest in the Mets as a stack. I've rostered a good amount of Francisco Lindor over the last, few weeks or so, just because his price had gotten so cheap. Here's the issue now. He has one good game, and all of a sudden the price point goes way up on Francisco Lindor. So there's a bunch of games where he's priced below 4K, and I'm thinking like, hey, I'm going to ride Francisco Lindor where he's cheap and nobody's playing him. He's one game where he scores 11 fantasy points. Now he's back up to 4,900, and it's like, boy, I really feel like I wasted a lot of shitty fantasy games out of Francisco Lindor because he has one good one, and now he's priced back up. The one hitter on the Mets that interests me the most going up against a lefty and Jordan Montgomery, Pete Alonso, 4,800 on DraftKings. I think he is one of the players most likely to homer today. Not really that much ownership going to him. Prop odds, he's currently plus 300 at a home run. That actually is one of the few home run props as a yes that has a positive ROI in our top props tool. So Pete Alonso, he is, I'm going to make a home run pick for the night. I'm going to say Pete Alonso. Him going up against the lefty, reasonable price tag. Also, no real ownership going there. So Pete Alonso I like as a one-off, but are there any Mets bats that you like, or do you like the team as a stack against Montgomery?
So I love Pete Alonso here. I don't really understand why he's as inexpensive as he is. Jordan Montgomery's allowed a 203 expected ISO to righties this year. We know Pete Alonso has massive power from the right side. I think you can look to James McCann as a catching option as well. That said, I actually have some interest in Montgomery, depending what this lineup looks like. But when you think about the Mets, most of their good hitters are left-handed. Alonso obviously right-handed, Lindor switch hits. That's about it from the right side. Jordan Montgomery's been very good against lefties this year. He struck out 29%. He's allowed no power. So I think there's a pretty good chance he's able to mitigate these guys like Conforto, Dom Smith, Jeff McNeil that you would typically worry about. And he's got a 22.2% strikeout percentage against righties, which isn't bad. I think it's a risky spot, but I do think that it's kind of a sneaky upside spot for Montgomery here.
And going into the next game now, I could see the reason for that. In my initial build, I didn't get to Montgomery. There's just other pitchers I like more. And one of them is a pitcher from this next game that I'm about to bring up. Actually, two of them kind of. Tampa Bay Rays against the Toronto Blue Jays. It does have a very high total at 10 runs. And by the way, some people were asking about weather in the YouTube chat. There is no weather right now that I'm super concerned about. But if there is one game right now that is the biggest risk, it is this game, the Toronto Blue Jays against the Tampa Bay Rays. It is in Buffalo. It looks like there's about a 40% chance of rain, so it is worth keeping an eye on. But right now, not something that I'm going to be off of for that reason. But Luis Patino is cheap, and he's also a pretty well-regarded prospect. If you look at his strikeout numbers in the minor leagues, they've been very strong. His strikeout numbers in the big leagues this year, 30.6% K rate. The other thing, too, with Patino is even though if you just look at his overall pitch count, it's not very substantial. Look at his most recent outing. He threw 82 pitches against the Baltimore Orioles the last time he pitched in the big leagues. Then he was sent down to the minor leagues, and it looks like he may have been stretched out a little bit more. But even just the potential to get, say 80 to 90 pitches out of Patino with his kind of strikeout upside, obviously the matchup couldn't get much more difficult, but he's so cheap. There's strikeout upside there. I don't mind him as a low-owned SP2 option on DK. How do you feel about him as a sneaky play?
Yeah. So one thing to clarify real quick, because you mentioned it and I agree on Jordan Montgomery, that wasn't really like a slate specific. Like I like Jordan Montgomery on this slate. It was more just, I think this is a good matchup for Montgomery. Oh. I'll have a better idea of who I'm actually getting to when I do the 5 o'clock show later on with Eric, with Eitan. But yeah, it was more of just, I think it is a sneaky good spot for Montgomery. I don't necessarily think I actually get to him on a 14-game slate. As far as Patino here, I agree completely. He threw 82 pitches, like you said, in that game against Baltimore. He's gone 5 innings in each of his last 3 games in the minor leagues. In his most recent one, he went 5 innings. I don't have the pitch count, but he went 5 innings. He struck out 11 guys. So and walked 2. So I think it's pretty safe to say he threw a decent number of pitches in that game. And like you said, one of the top pitching prospects in baseball. He has a massive strikeout percentage pretty much at every level that he's pitched at. And, the matchup's not great here against Toronto, but this is another example too, kind of like I mentioned with the Dodgers implied run total against Scherzer, 4.2, not being high, but it's high for a Scherzer opponent. 5.3 for the Blue Jays is a high implied run total, but because of the park that they play in, the Blue Jays are typically coming in at like 6.5. So it's actually a relatively low implied run total for the environment. And I think that speaks favorably to Patino as well. He's not expensive. There's certainly risk. You have to understand that, but there's massive upside for a guy at 6,800 that has this kind of strikeout stuff.
Yeah. And that's really the big thing for me. Also, just that he's so cheap, but yeah, I mean, you said his strikeout stuff. If you look at his minor league numbers, he's fairly consistently been around a 30% K rate during the minor leagues. And that's what he has in his limited amount of time in the big leagues this year, also 30.6% K rate. So for that reason, Patino is somebody who I'm going to be mixing into my builds for sure. I think there's upside there. But on the other side, going up against the Toronto Blue Jays, who the offense has stuttered a little bit as of late. It's still one of the most potent offenses in baseball. But given how good Patino is, I think it is potential that we could see him, hold them to not a massive game or anything like that, just kind of keep them in check. We only have him with a 3.6% chance to be a top stack on the slate. Given the price tags on Toronto, I find it a little bit difficult to get to them on the slate.
Yeah, I agree. They are projected for like no ownership, which is pretty nice, 1.3% ownership share. So that makes them kind of interesting. I think they'd maybe be a little bit more interesting if Patino's getting a lot of ownership, which it doesn't. He's not right now. He's basically getting like none. If that changes throughout the day, they become a little bit more interesting. But right now, it's more of just a spot, I think, similar to the Yankees, similar to the Dodgers, where I don't think it's a super high probability spot, but it is a favorable ballpark to hit in. And you are facing somewhat of an unknown in Patino, even though he certainly has the pedigree and the strikeout stuff to have success. You still have a very high upside offense here for Toronto. So if their ownership stays around 1%, they're another large field tournament team, I think, but not something I would anticipate really prioritizing here because I do have a lot of respect for Patino and the Rays pitching staff in general.
Yeah, and then on the other side, Alek Manoah, I kind of view in the same kind of boat as Patino, not picking up much ownership for GPPs. I think he's a viable SP2 option just because of his strikeout stuff. That Manoah's had success this year. He's a 3.34 ERA, 3.40 expected ERA. Some good luck he's benefited from here because he only has a 214 BABIP. Although if you look at some of his contact numbers, he's not giving up that much hard contact. So, at least that's reason to think the BABIP should be a little bit lower, but it's not like he's going to maintain a 214 BABIP or anything like that. But, Manoah this year, 26.8% K rate. If you look at his minor league numbers, in AAA this year, 40.9% K rate. Obviously, no minor league numbers for 2020, but if you go back to 2019, 39.7% K rate. Manoah is still largely an unknown quantity. He is also somebody who's very well regarded as a prospect and appears to have good strikeout stuff. Average fastball velocity decent this year at 93.6 miles per hour. But another guy, potential SP2, not in the best matchup in the world against the Tampa Bay Rays, but Manoah is good enough that I don't really want to stack the Rays, but Manoah enough strikeout upside that I think that he's also worth mixing into the tournament player pool.
Yeah, I agree with the strikeout upside there. He's typically going 90 to 100 pitches when he pitches well. I don't love the price tag on him at 7,900, but I think it's fine. I can see, why you get there. I do have some interest in the Tampa bats against him, though, because where he has struggled so far in the majors is with left-handed hitters and left-handed power in particular. 24% strikeout percentage against lefties is fine, but it's still 5 points lower than he has against righties. What stands out, though, is the 218 expected ISO, 271 actual ISO to left-handed hitters so far. And this Tampa team's getting a huge park upgrade going from Tropicana Field to whatever the name of the field is that Toronto plays on right now. Brandon Lau has a lot of power from the left side. Wander Franco is a switch hitter. Austin Meadows has power. Choi has power. Joey Wendell can do some damage. Like, there's some powerful left-handed bats in this lineup. And then you mix in guys like Randy Arozarena and Manny Margot that have some upside in their own right. I think it's kind of a scary spot for Manoah. The Rays right now have the fifth highest top stack percentage on the slate, and they're projected to be owned about where they should be, maybe a little bit under owned. I do think it's a very high upside spot for the Rays.
Yeah, I could see that. Just kind of in the interest of not stacking everybody. They're a team that I didn't get to in my initial build, but it is still a fairly substantial run total, 10 runs, and it is a very favorable offensive environment. So, that might maybe I should walk that back a little bit and maybe get some more exposure to the Rays as the day goes on. But still early. I don't know exactly who the hell I'm rostering. It's just my initial builds and what I'm looking at first glance on a 14-game slate. 9 hours before the slate locks. But next game, this is a pitcher that I am almost certainly going to be rostering at a high clip. Chicago Cubs against the Cincinnati Reds. Sonny Gray coming off the injured list today, only 7,500 on DraftKings. In the build that I made this morning, Sonny Gray was my most rostered pitcher on both FanDuel and DK. 7,500 on DK, like I said, 7,000 on FanDuel. The only concern I have here is there potential for him to be on a pitch count? A little early to know. I looked for information on it and didn't see anything this morning. I don't know if you saw anything different on that, but if we're just going to see Sonny Gray full go, or at least like 90% of his normal pitch count, I think he's the best value of all the pitchers on the slate.
Yeah, I mean, my concern is that he went 3 innings in his rehab start, struck out 4, walked 3. I kind of doubt that it's always hard to say because you don't know what these guys did like on their throw day either. You don't really know what he was doing prior to that rehab start or anything like that. But just based on what he did in the rehab start, I'm more inclined to think that you're getting like 5 innings out of Gray than a fully stretched out Gray. And so that is somewhat concerning, especially when you consider that he is going to get ownership right now, projected for the second most ownership on DraftKings. But the salary, to some extent at least, does mitigate those risks. Like, if you get 5 innings of a pitcher with a 30% strikeout percentage of 7,500, he's still pretty likely to be one of the better pitching options on the slate. So I am still interested, but I do think the ownership scares me a little bit because not only do you have the risk of, we don't know how deep Sonny Gray can go into this game, we also Sonny Gray hasn't pitched a major league game in almost a month. So, and like I said, in those 3 innings at AAA, he struck out 4, walked 3. That's something that, the walks are something Gray has had plenty of issues with in the past. We don't know how sharp he's going to be in the start either. So I do think that it's a pretty big question mark. There's a lot of unknowns here. But as part of those unknowns, he does have a massive ceiling.
So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here, and early in the day, and certainly Adam's going to be on the MLB show later in the day at 5:00 doing the deep dive. I believe he said it's Aton who's hosting. So 3 pitchers who I would be considering for cash games on DraftKings right now: Max Scherzer, Lance Lynn, Sonny Gray. If you had to pick 2 of them as of right now, and obviously you could change your answer later in the day, which 2 do you think you'd be picking?
I would start with Scherzer Lynn and kind of see what the lineup looks like. On 14-game slates, typically you're going to find plenty of value bats, especially later on as lineups come out and some random dudes are hitting third that are like 2,300 that nobody expected. So, I mean, I would start with Scherzer Lynn. I would be relatively quick to drop to Scherzer Gray, if I need to get to some bats, because I do think that salary, especially because Gray's getting ownership too. So, like, again, in cash games, you're not taking a massive stand probably if you play Sonny Gray, because if he fails, you probably are failing with like 50% of the field or something like that. Whereas in tournaments, if he fails, there's a massive reward if you don't have him. But I would ideally get Scherzer Lynn, but I think Gray is a perfectly good SP2 option if you need him to open up some salary.
So then on the other side, there is some uncertainty here with Sonny Gray. Like, he hasn't pitched in a while. We don't know exactly what his pitch count is. I tend to think that later in the day, we're going to see a beat reporter come out and say, because we see this a lot with marquee pitchers. When one of them comes off the injured list, we haven't seen them pitch in a little while. usually we'll get, Reds beat report will come out and say like, hey, according to the manager, he's going to be throwing 70, 75 pitches. He's going to be on a 5-inning restriction, something along those lines. But, as of right now, uncertainty. We don't know what to expect, although it does seem that Gray is going to be a little bit popular. But given some of that variance there right now in Sonny Gray, are you willing to take shots on the Chicago Cubs against him?
A lot there comes down to the ownership, I think. If we get some report that Sonny Gray is limited to 70 pitches and his ownership goes from 22% to 10% or something, my interest in the Cubs will pretty quickly decline. But if he is going to be 20 to 25% owned, this is one spot. I know I mentioned at the top that typically on larger field slates, I'm not as inclined to just leverage stack against a good pitcher that's popular. But I think there's enough uncertainty around Gray, combined with the fact that this park is favorable for hitters. If you get Sonny Gray just coming out here not being able to throw strikes because he's rusty or whatever and not missing as many bats as usual, if he's putting guys on base in Cincinnati, things can get really ugly really quickly. So the Cubs are, I think, a team where if Gray is getting ownership, they're interesting to me.
And then on the other side, Alec Mills starting for the Chicago Cubs. Hard for me to really be interested in Mills. I doubt he's going to throw very many pitches. He rarely does. He has thrown, bringing up his pitch count numbers right now, recent outings for Alec Mills. He threw 69 pitches, 77, 57, 24. So, it has trended up a little bit, but still Alec Mills, not somebody who I think is going to work all that deep into the game. But on the other side, the Cincinnati Reds, I don't think it's a bad spot for them. But it does look like they're going really over-owned right now. They're currently projected to have the 4th most ownership overall on DraftKings, actually tied for the Royals with the fourth most ownership. And it's not to say it's a bad spot. It's just the field's getting to them too heavy. It's a team that on a 14-game slate where I'm looking to try to cut teams and players out of my player pool to make it a little bit tighter. The Reds, based on that information, they would be a team I would cut out.
Yeah. One other thing I forgot to mention on the Cubs, they are a team in this spot against Gray. I'm more interested kind of in either full stacking the Cubs or just not having them, because if Sonny Gray is on, you don't really want any of these hitters against him. If he's off, you want all of them. So whereas a team like Tampa Bay, I think you can just grab one off to hit for power. The Cubs, I'm more inclined to just have all of them or none of them. As far as the Reds go, I agree with you completely. The spot's fine. It's a favorable hitter's park. Alec Mills doesn't miss a lot of bats. He typically does do a pretty good job of limiting power, particularly to right-handed hitters, but across the board also. And the biggest thing, like you said, the Reds getting about twice as much ownership right now as their top stack percentage, which is something that always drives me away from a team, especially on a slate this big, where there's going to be a lot of teams that I can kind of move that exposure to that are getting lower ownership. So it's an okay spot for the Reds, I think. I don't love it. I don't hate it, but I do think they are getting a little more ownership than they deserve.
Yeah, and next pitcher, here's a guy who used to be one of my favorite pitchers in baseball, Lance McCullers for the Houston Astros. Coming off of numerous arm issues at this point, he's had a shoulder issue. He had Tommy John surgery. He's pitched much better than expected this year to me, at least given some of the results we saw from him last year coming back from the injury. The one big red flag I see with Lance McCullers, other than the 236 BABIP, that's going to regress a little bit. His average fastball velocity has dipped, about a mile per hour versus what he was pre-surgery. So 93.4 miles per hour is his average fastball velocity. The year before getting hurt, he had a 94.2 average fastball velocity. So we're seeing his strikeout rate. It's still solid, although he's also walking a lot more guys. So maybe a little bit less arm talent now for Lance McCullers than he had pre-surgery. And while if you get a low percentage of him, it's not an issue with me. I just don't think he warrants a 9,400 price tag on the road in Cleveland. So Lance McCullers overall, whatever, if you're playing 150 lineups, you get to 4 or 5% of them. That's not an issue for me. But if you're somebody who plays, 2, 3, 5 lineups, Lance McCullers is not somebody I would consider.
Yeah, that's pretty much where I'm at too. It's a tough matchup, a relatively tough matchup against Cleveland. Not my favorite spot to get to. And one thing that stands out is that he's only struck out 24% of left-handed hitters this year. The reason that stands out is that typically in the past, he's actually had a higher strikeout percentage against lefties than he has against righties. This year, that hasn't been the case. 24% against lefties, 27.7 against righties. So it makes me think that maybe his stuff, is just different across the board. He is walking a lot of guys as well, as I think you mentioned. So not like a lot in the past, if you had McCullers going up against a left-handed heavy lineup like Cleveland, I'd be really interested from an upside standpoint. But there is some stuff in his numbers this year, apart from just the fact that he's had arm injuries, that concerns me here. So I think there's still a ceiling for him. Like you said, if you're getting to a little bit, he's projected for 3% ownership. If you're getting, to a little bit more than that across 150 lineups, I think that's fine. But I would rather, if I'm going to take a stand on a low-owned 9K guy, I think I'd rather be looking to Julio Urias than McCullers.
Yeah, that's also how I feel. I prefer Urias to McCullers. I'm also curious. I'm bringing up his player page right now on Baseball Savant just to see his spin rate in recent games, and it's actually looked pretty solid. He's actually had his two highest spin rate starts of the year. Two of the three highest were two of his last two starts. So last time out, 24.33 average spin rate, and the one before 25.72. That was actually his high watermark for the year. It looks like. What's funny is the Houston Astros. For all of the crap this team takes with cheating and whatnot, with the trash can stuff and stealing signs a couple years ago, none of their pitchers have taken a significant drop off with the change in substance rates. Like McCullers has still pitched pretty well. We've seen Urquidy have some good starts. We've seen Framber Valdez pitch well. This looks like the team that was maybe using the least pitcher substance, at least this year, of any team in the league.
Yeah, McCullers, since June 6th, he's actually averaging 97 more rotations per minute on his breaking stuff than he was before. So, it is interesting there. One thing, and I didn't even think to look at it before, I just happened to see it when I was looking at the colors in my spreadsheet. Sonny Gray only made one start since June 6th when they started cracking down. He lost 193 rotations per minute on his breaking ball. He threw it 7% less than he was in the past. So just another, huge question mark to add to the list there.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll add on Sonny Gray, that's also, if I'm not mistaken, that's the start he got hurt and only threw 50 pitches. So that also could have been injury related. But anyway, he threw, it was 50 pitches in that start. It was against the Milwaukee Brewers. That was the start he got hurt. So yeah, and it's hard to know what to make of that. Did it dip because of some sort of change he had to make because he didn't have sticky fingers anymore? Was it because he was hurt? Most likely it was probably a combination of the two. But yeah, I think that is another interesting point to bring up, is it just adds more, volatility to the mix, and maybe an unknown factor on Sonny Gray. But starting on the opposite side of Lance McCullers, Sam Hentges, who is a guy this year who has not pitched well at all, 7.32 ERA, 6.82 expected ERA. He also has not been working very deep into games. He's been kind of an opener who's been stretched out to pitch a few innings, but I think it's a pretty good spot for the Houston Astros. Their offense has been pretty prolific for the most part this year. We have them with a 6.8% chance of being a top stack on the slate, which is the third best odds, not picking up all that much ownership. So Houston's a pretty high priority spot for me against Hentges.
Yeah, I agree. Third highest top stack percentage, not getting a lot of ownership. Hentges has given up a lot of power to righties, 292 expected ISO, 226 actual ISO, and you have tons of right-handed power in this lineup. You should have Altuve, Gurriel, Correa all in there. Toro hits from the right side against lefties. Miles Straw gives you some speed at the top of the order. And then obviously you can go to like Jordan Alvarez and Kyle Tucker as well, just because they're really good hitters. So I'm with you. I do like the Astros a lot.
Yeah, that is the team who right now I think I'm leaning towards getting the most exposure to them as a stack, just based on the overall stack odds, and then also it having a lot less ownership than the Colorado game. So to me, this looks like a pretty favorable spot, and pretty much everybody across the lineup, guys that I want to get to today. You highlighted most of them, but the other thing that I'll mention also with Houston is there are guys at the bottom of the order who are not that expensive that also don't pick up that much ownership typically, that have some upside. Miles Straw, less than 1% projected ownership. He's had some good games this year. Kyle Tucker, I don't understand the price tag on him at all, given his power upside, 3,800 in this matchup. Michael Brantley is cheap at 4,100. And even though Sam Hentges is a left-handed pitcher, and so he's going to have the platoon advantage against those guys, maybe that's also something that's driving the algorithm today. Don't forget, Hentges is not somebody who's going to be throwing 100 pitches and working deep into the game anyway. At some point, it's most likely that Michael Brantley, Kyle Tucker, these guys are going to be facing a right-handed pitcher. So with that in mind, I'm not concerned at all about the platoon thing here. And it's also showing up to be pretty favorable when you can get these guys at almost no ownership because people are looking at a lefty-lefty matchup. Yeah,
and one other thing to add to that too, small sample size, only 150 pitches against lefties this year, but Hentges has allowed a 208 expected ISO. You look at Jordan Alvarez since the start of last season, has a 212 ISO against left-handed pitching. Kyle Tucker's at 194 with a 269 expected ISO. So you have a left-handed pitcher who has given up some expected power to lefties. You have lefties that are very good hitters and hold their own against lefties. Typically, their ownership is going to be driven down a little bit because of the lefty-lefty matchup. So I do really like including those guys in your Houston stacks.
All right, guys, if you haven't done it yet, do us a favor, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel because you want to know whenever we got shows going on. Basketball is winding down. We're going to have a lot more baseball coming up. Adam's going to be on later today. We have MLB Deeper Dive. We have MLB Live Before Lock. So, going forward, especially with the NBA, once the finals wraps up, there's going to be a lot of baseball content. We're going to be doing shows for early Live Before Locks, late Live Before Locks, Deeper Dive. So lots of baseball content. Also subscribe to the podcast network, because if you're on the go, sitting in the car, don't want to look at our faces, all reasonable reasons you might want to subscribe to the Awesemo podcast network, and also be able to listen to that when maybe you're not home or don't have access to YouTube. So please do that. And also, like I said, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Next game that we have on the slate here, another prime pitching spot. Lance Lynn going up against the Detroit Tigers. The Tigers have one of the worst offenses in baseball. Lance Lynn has been pretty consistent all year. And something else that's always favorable to me about Lance Lynn that we can't say about a whole lot of other pitchers in baseball, he's always, no matter where he's pitched, he's been given a pretty long leash on the mound. And he's somebody who, fairly consistently throws a lot of pitches, works deep into games. So it's something that doesn't really show up if you're just looking at, his strikeout numbers, walk numbers, that kind of stuff. But anybody who's able to get a few extra outs in the game, that leads to more fantasy points. And the other thing also to consider with Lance Lynn, though, he does have a career-high strikeout rate. He's been more effective in that department, 28.5% strikeout rate. That's up from 23.6% for his career. Then you also get the matchup against the Tigers. So without much doubt, Lance Lynn is one of my favorite pitching options today.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, it's a good matchup against the Tigers. Everything looks good for Lynn. If I had to point to one potential negative, it's that for most of Lynn's career, he's had massive splits in his strikeout numbers, righties versus lefties. That changed last year when he started striking out lefties. Last year he struck out lefties at a higher clip than he did righties. But this year he's back to having a massive split where he struck out 34.8% of righties, only 22.5% of lefties. The Tigers will still give you strikeouts. Like, they're still, not a very good team. But I would love this spot if the Tigers had a right-handed heavy lineup. They'll most likely have a left-handed heavy lineup. So I think it hurts Lynn a little bit there. But all that being said, you're kind of just, splitting hairs and nitpicking on a guy that is going to most likely throw a lot of pitches. Like you said, he's facing a bad offense. He's overall a very good pitcher. So I do still really like Lance Lynn a lot.
Yeah, it's hard to get around it to me. The Tigers offense just been so weak this year, and Lynn has pitched so well. And then on the other side of the game, Casey Mize, he's somebody who, he's pitched better as of late, but we're still looking at a guy who hasn't quite put it together yet. 24 years old, was the number one overall pick in the 2018 draft. He's a very well-regarded prospect. Good stuff, 94.4 average fastball velocity. His ERA this year, 3.46, so that's significantly better than last year, but still does appear like he's going to be facing some regression. 5.08 expected ERA, 4.65 FIP. The strikeout stuff still not really there, despite the really good stuff just by the eye test. K rate 19.8% this year. So Casey Mize, I think there is a future where I want to be rostering him more consistently. There have been some smaller slates where I've taken chances on him just because it's been slates where it's small, he's cheap, there aren't good pitching options. But for a slate like this, 14 games, I don't really have interest in Casey Mize. And given that I think he's heading for regression and the White Sox have a good offense, I don't mind stacking against him.
Yeah, agreed. He's kind of just priced at $9K for his name and his prospect status more so than anything he's shown the ability to do so far in the majors. Moncada, not expected to play for the White Sox today, is like hurtful to their stack. He'd be a guy that I really liked. Mize in particular has really, really struggled with left-handed power, both last year and so far this year. So I think looking to $3,300 Brian Goodwin, probably hitting second, is a very good spot to look. Yasmani Grandal at catcher is fine. Gavin Sheets is a value option that's very inexpensive and most likely batting sixth or seventh is reasonable as well. So I think it's a high upside spot for the White Sox. I do just really wish from a stacking standpoint that Moncada was in this lineup.
Yeah, he got, I remember it was a wrist injury yesterday. I can't remember if he got hit by a pitch or if it was something else that happened. But yeah, he came out of the game after, I think it was 2 plate appearances, didn't finish. So we could miss an extended period of time. It does hurt them a little bit. But even with that said, Casey Mize is a pitcher who, given the context of this slate, also given that Casey Mize is really expensive, no interest in rostering him at all. White Sox, a team that I have a little bit interest in stacking. Next game here, Pablo Lopez going up against Drew Smyly. So the Miami Marlins, Atlanta Braves in Atlanta. I like Pablo Lopez a lot as a pitcher. He's been really solid this year, but it's hard for me to justifiably roster him in Atlanta. Really tough matchup. And then also you consider, all these other guys that are priced kind of around him today. So not a pitcher that I'm looking to get to, but I think the question here is, do you think he's able to pitch well enough to maybe limit some of the damage the Braves can do?
Yeah, I think he actually, I'm interested. If Ronald Acuna doesn't play today, I think Lopez is actually pretty interesting because if you take Acuna out of that lineup, it obviously weakens the lineup a lot. And against right-handed bats this year, Lopez has a 31.6% strikeout percentage. He's done a good job against lefties of limiting power, but he's only struck out 20%. But when you look at the Braves lineup, you have Austin Riley, Dansby Swanson, Heredia, Contreras, all right-handed. you have the pitcher spot. The only lefties you're really concerned about are Freddie Freeman and Ozzie Albies. I think, and then, guys like Riley strike out a ton as well. So I think there's actually some sneaky upside here. Again, you're not necessarily saying I'm jamming him into a bunch of lineups, but I do think he's in that boat with like Julio Urias, where he's not getting much ownership at his price tag, and he does have a pretty high ceiling. If Acuna is out of this lineup, I think it really weakens the Braves lineup as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt there if there's no Acuna. I mean, Acuna is probably the second best player in the National League right now. I put Tatis 1, and then Acuna is probably 2 behind him. Acuna has been a little more inconsistent this year, but yeah, even so, for sure, I think that is a good point that I was overlooking a little bit there. Ronald Acuna, I think it was back spasms he got scratched with late yesterday. Not that it mattered. Nobody was touching Jacob deGrom after the first inning anyway. First inning gave up 3 runs. Then after that was just lights out, ended up being the high scoring fantasy pitcher for the day. But yeah, Pablo Lopez, if there is no Ronald Acuna, it does become a better spot for him. I don't have interest in stacking against Pablo Lopez just because of how good he's been, especially if Acuna is out. It just lowers the overall ability of the lineup. But still Atlanta, pretty potent offense. They're going to be at home, which is a favorable hitting park. Would you be looking to stack against Pablo Lopez at all?
Not really, because again, like he's done a good job limiting power to lefties. Albies and Freeman certainly can do damage against anyone, but they're not really cheap either. And then from the right side, outside of Acuna, if he's in the lineup, I just don't think it sets up as a very good spot for guys like Swanson and Riley. So not really a team that I'm that interested in getting to.
And then as we talk about Drew Smyly, it's like I'm going to add a betting note here also. So a lot of times when players are ruled out in basketball, books are pretty quick to take lines off the board or adjust them. A bet here that I think would make sense if Acuna is not in the lineup, the run total is still fairly high in this game at 9 runs. I think the team total for the Braves, depending what book you look at, is either 4.5 or 5 runs. If there's no Acuna in the lineup going up against Pablo Lopez, that's a number that I would be looking to bet the under on. And I don't bet a ton of baseball games outright, but that is actually something that would interest me. Being able to get under 5 runs for the Atlanta Braves without Ronald Acuna in the lineup in a tough spot against Pablo Lopez. I think that would be a kind of interesting betting option, or then maybe even the Marlins outright, because Drew Smyly, not a particularly good pitcher. I get the Marlins don't have a good offense either, but 4.79 ERA for Drew Smyly this year, 5.01 expected ERA. The strikeout stuff has absolutely fallen off a cliff for Drew Smyly. His velocity has as well. Last year, 93.7 average fastball velocity. This year, 92.4, so down 1.3 miles per hour. As a result, 19.7% K rate, by far the lowest of Drew Smyly's career. So a matchup here, stoppable force versus a movable object. Smiley's no good. The Marlins offense is no good. But is there either side here that you would side with?
Don't love either side. One individual spot I do love is Adam Duvall at 3,800. This is a guy who, since the start of the 2019 season, 165 plate appearances against left-handed pitching, 309 ISO, 357 WOBA. Like you said, Smyly not missing bats against righties, 17.7% strikeout percentage. Also, potentially some issues with spin rate. Since June 6th, he has the 24th highest drop off in his fastball spin rate. His called plus swinging strike percentage has gone from 28.3% before June 6th to 23.2% since then. So, there's some potentially he's being negatively affected by this. But even if he wasn't, I would really like Duvall as a guy that I think is pretty likely to homer today.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable to take. Also, Duvall is also a guy who, we've seen him spark a whole lot of upside for fantasy. Like there are games where Adam Duvall, he scores 0 fantasy points every game for a week. Then all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, Adam Duvall's homered 6 times in the last 2 games. And kind of something he's been doing a little bit right now. He is homered in back-to-back games. And also it's funny, it's sandwiched. So he homered in the last 2 games. The 2 games before that scored 0 fantasy points. The game before that, he homered. The 4 games prior to that, he had a total of 2 hits. And then in the 2 games prior to those ones, he had a total of 4 home runs, back-to-back 2 homer games. So Adam Duvall, one of the streakier hitters we have in baseball. And yeah, I do think that, especially relative to his price tag, I don't think there's anybody with a sub 4K price tag on DraftKings more likely to homer than Adam Duvall. So yeah. I like that. I like that quite a bit.
Doesn't he randomly have 3 home run games in the last 2 years too, or something like that?
Yeah, it might even be more than that.
Yeah.
I know there's definitely been a handful of slates for baseball where it's been like, oh, cool, I have really good stacks, but Adam Duvall's 0.6% owned. He scored 70 fantasy points today and just broke the slate. So Adam Duvall, one of the most random high upside fantasy players that there is in the sport. Speaking of upside spots, though, the next game in Colorado, playing in altitude at Denver, two terrible pitchers on the mound, Oviedo versus Chichi Gonzalez. The run total in this game is 12.5 runs. There's also, in general, there isn't a whole lot of ownership concerns on this slate. However, the St. Louis Cardinals on a 14-game slate are projecting for 21% ownership as a stack on DraftKings. Massive total for any individual stack on a slate this size. So what do you do with the Cardinals, who are in an obvious good spot, but also appear to be picking up way more ownership than they should?
Yeah, typically I'll end up just coming in under the field on the Cardinals in large field tournaments because, of course they're likely to be the top scoring stack on the slate, but 85% of the time they're not going to be, according to the top stack tool. That's still, obviously a large majority of the time. It's still baseball. They can even score a lot of runs and not be the top stack because they don't happen to hit a bunch of homers. And the raw ownership does still, matter, because if you're talking about these tournaments where there's 20,000 people and 20% of the field is stacking the Cardinals, there's just a lot easier way to win by not having them, especially on these bigger slates where there's a lot of teams that have really high ceilings. Houston, Tampa Bay, the Yankees, the Dodgers, like so many teams we've talked about that we've liked the stacks are just naturally going to get much, much, much lower ownership because everyone's going to the Cardinals. So I obviously love the Cardinals. There's no reason that you wouldn't. Chichi Gonzalez isn't any good. He doesn't miss bats. They're in Coors Field. Everything's great for the Cardinals. But I do think that it's just a situation where if you played 14 game Coors Field slates all season long and you just went to the teams that are not getting 20% ownership, you would just make a lot more money.
Yeah, it's really, and by the way, also, so the build I had this morning, just based on the ownership, I'm very, very light on the Cardinals. And, there's not a single hitter in their lineup that I have at more than 6% of my lineups right now. My most rostered hitter is Tyler O'Neill at 6%. Obviously, if the Cardinals go out and have a big game, not a crazy outcome to predict. I would get screwed for the night. However, to the point you said, it's still a probability game. They are not as likely to be the top scoring team relative to their odds. And we see so in the YouTube chat right now, Brian Claremont says that he likes Goldschmidt, Arenado, O'Neill. That is reasonable. You know who else likes those guys? Everybody. The current projected ownership for Paul Goldschmidt, 30%. Tyler O'Neill, 32%. Arenado, 21%. So a little bit lower because of the price tag. But even so, you have to ask yourself, on a 14-game slate, is it really Paul Goldschmidt who's going to be in the optimal lineup a third of the time? Is Tyler O'Neill going to be in the optimal lineup 32% of the time? Probably not. So to have these guys in your player pool, sure, that's reasonable. I just can't get anywhere near the field on these numbers. I never do for slates this large. And it goes one of two ways. Either it goes very well or very poorly, which is kind of the crux of baseball slates more often than time. A lot of slates, it's like, hey, I lost most of my entry fees. Hey, I won 20x. I lost most of my entry fees. Lost most of my entry fees. Went 10x. But those are kind of the ways you play with ownership on baseball. Generally, slates this size, ownership isn't a concern. This is the one spot where it's a massive issue. Less so on the other side of the game, though. So the Colorado Rockies, if I'm playing one side of the game, they do look like the more favorable side to stack based on some of the ownership numbers we have here. Colorado on FanDuel only projected for 10.8% ownership as a team. On DraftKings, Colorado as a team currently projected for 11.2%. Maybe a little bit overowned, but nothing crazy. It looks like about reasonable ownership. So if I'm stacking one side of the Coors Field game, I do prefer Colorado to St. Louis.
Yeah, and also as far as St. Louis goes, in cash games, by all means, play as many of these Cardinal bats as you can. Staying away from them strictly as tournaments. But Colorado, they're a little bit overowned, but not as much as the Cardinals are, and also just not as much raw ownership. Like you can, even though they're a little overowned, you can handle 10% of the field having your stack a lot easier than 20%. For obvious reasons. And the reason the Rockies aren't getting as much ownership is that their pricing makes a little bit more sense, at least. Charlie Blackmon at 5,500, Story at 5,800, McMahon at 5K. Whereas you look at the Cardinals, and Arenado's expensive, but every other hitter on that team is sub 5K. Dylan Carlson most likely leading off at 3,900. It's just going to be very, very, very easy to get to the Cardinals and still do whatever you want with the rest of your lineup. Whereas the Rockies, you might have to actually make some sacrifices, and that'll drive their ownership down. But they have about the same implied run total as the Cardinals, over 6. Oviedo, not a scary pitcher at all against lefties in particular. He really hasn't missed bats this year. Only a 12% strikeout percentage. So I think guys like Tapia, Blackmon, McMahon should be able to put the ball in play against him. If I'm going to one of these two teams in tournaments, I'd be more inclined to go to the Rockies.
Yeah, that's how I feel too. It's a Coors Field game, like you said. Cash games, play all the Cardinals you can. These guys are going to be massively on. Probably cash games, these guys are probably going to be north of 50% on tournaments. I prefer the Rocky side, although still relative to ownership. Not the highest priority stack, just something I want to be kind of in line with the field on. Next game here, not nearly the same offensive environment, but still a fairly high run total, 10 runs. So this is tied for the second highest run total on the slate. So we have Rockies, Cardinals by far the highest at 12.5, then 10 runs for the Tampa Bay Toronto game, 10 runs for the Kansas City and Twins game here. J Happ, he's been very miserable going up against Brady Singer, who is a guy, doesn't have the best ERA at 4.7. However, you look at the underlying numbers, 3.71 ERA, 3.97 FIP. That's enough for me to look at the Kansas City Royals and think this isn't quite of a favorable spot. Perhaps as the field seems to think, they are going fairly overowned. So the Royals a stack that I don't have interest in. But first, talking about these pitchers here, given that the Royals might be a little bit popular, Brady Singer also, fairly cheap and maybe headed for positive regression, would you be willing to roster Brady Singer as an SP2?
I think it's hard to get to on this slate. I agree with everything you're saying. He's really not been bad when you look at that stuff outside of results. 24% strikeout percentage against lefties, 22% against righties, only a .08 expected ISO to righties. Lefties are at 179, which is okay. The salary's fine. It's just that I still have respect for the Twins. I still don't love taking pitchers against them. It's a lineup that does have, just some pretty dangerous bats in it. So, I think Singer is actually a pretty decent arm. I just still have trouble getting to him today.
Yeah, and I just realized I accidentally said going up against the Royals when he pitches for the Royals. So to me, just with Brady Singer, I don't really want to stack against him. And then just as a low priority SP2, I don't mind mixing him in just because I do think there's positive regression heading his way. That and the strikeout stuff, it's okay relative to his price point, 23.2%. And then, like I said, too, like some of those numbers, the 332 BABIP, that's going to be better going forward. The strand rate, 68%, that's going to be better going forward. So I'm not going to be looking to stack the Twins against Brady Singer today, but at the same merit, I think that Brady Singer, not a high priority play, but somebody I don't mind getting into a couple of lineups. But J Happ on the other side, he's been miserable pretty much all year. Although I guess a couple of okay starts lately, but nothing that I would think we should bank on going forward because J Happ now is 38 years old. His fastball velocity now sits at 91 miles per hour, the lowest of his career, and 5.83 ERA this year, 5.35 FIP. The Kansas City Royals, it's just an issue to me where they are, fairly substantially owned relative to this slate. And there's other teams I'd rather stack than them, even though J Happ has struggled. But the Royals, is this a team that you would like to play?
I like the spot. I am concerned about the ownership, like you said. Right now, 3.8% chance of being the top stack, 6.2% aggregate ownership. I think Jorge Soler in particular stands out as a phenomenal value, someone that, if I do, for example, the Scherzer Lynn build in cash, I would assume it probably includes Jorge Soler at 3,400. He's got, a ton of power from the right side. J Happ doesn't miss bats. So I think Soler looks great. Merrifield more expensive, Perez more expensive, both very good plays if you can get to them. Hunter Dozier, a cheap power hitting righty in a very good spot as well. So I just think that the salaries on guys like Soler and Dozier in particular are going to drive up ownership, at least there, and maybe on like Kansas City mini stacks and full stacks. So the ownership's the concern, but I do like the spot against Happ. And I'm looking now at the individual ownership for Kansas City. And it is a team where, I think even though there's a lot of aggregate ownership, so much of it right now, we have 16% going to Salvador Perez. We have 13% going to Soler, 7% going to Dozier. Nobody else on DraftKings above 5%. So it is one of those situations where you can potentially, like, let's say you leave Salvador Perez off of your stack, or you leave Soler off or whatever, like you're still going to get some pretty low owned guys that will help you kind of not be too chalky by stacking them.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to go about it because it is a good matchup against Happ. If I was going to play the Royals, I would be looking to play some of the lesser owned bats to be maybe a little bit contrarian because I do think that the guys who are the premier hitters in the lineup may be a little bit more popular than I'd be willing to play. Next spot here, we get to pick on another Orioles pitcher who, shocking, the Orioles do not have a good starter on the mound today. Keegan Aiken, 7.11 ERA, 5.11 expected ERA. I want to check something really quick because I forgot about this earlier. First, give me your thoughts on Keegan Aiken. I'm going to check if FanDuel has actually listed Shohei Ohtani as an outfielder today and not a pitcher.
That would be nice. My thoughts on Keegan Aiken are that he's just kind of a stopgap guy. Like, he has a future maybe in the bullpen for Baltimore. He's not going to be one of their starters long term, and he's struggled this year, particularly with right-handed power. 203 expected ISO to righties, 16.8% strikeout percentage against right-handed hitters. He threw 82 pitches against Toronto, 83 the game before that. So, like, he is fully stretched out. But I think it sets up as a good spot for the Angels. Pretty favorable pricing too. David Fletcher, not a power hitter, but he's cheap, most likely leading off. Certainly someone you could look to in cash games if you're looking to save some money. Anthony Rendon in a very good spot, I think. Taylor Ward, another potential value option. So on the one hand, the Angels offense kind of sucks without Mike Trout. Like, you have Ohtani that you want to roster. You have Rendon that you want to roster. Other than that, it's kind of ugly. But on the other hand, Keegan Aiken, not very good. And it is a very high upside spot for the Angels.
Yeah, and good news, Shohei Ohtani is available to play as an outfielder today. He is 4,500 on FanDuel. Yesterday, the game ended up getting canceled, so it didn't matter, but he was listed only as a pitcher at 9,500, and the game also ended up getting rained out, so didn't end up being an issue there. However, if the slate would have played, we only would have gotten Shohei Ohtani as a pitcher, and who knows if the points would have counted, and FanDuel certainly was going to answer the question ahead of time. So today
I was going to on the topic of Ohtani, who is now back to 5,900 on DraftKings as well. Since 2019, he has 267 plate appearances against left-handed pitching, 355 WOBA, 244 ISO. Don't shy away from this guy just because it's lefty-lefty.
No, not at all. The other thing too is, when we've talked about some bad starting pitching, I would be shocked if Keegan Aiken goes deep into this game. So it's not like he's going to be facing a left-handed pitcher the entire time. Like we said, Aiken this year has a 7.11 ERA, a 5.11 expected ERA. The most likely outcome here is that Keegan Aiken struggles, and then the Orioles go to their terrible bullpen, and then Ohtani faces a bad righty pitcher at some point in the game. So, yeah, Ohtani's a pay-up option just fine. Pitching for the Angels today, Griffin Canning. He's had some inconsistent results since breaking into the league. Really was strong. Highly rated prospect when he first got called up from the minors. Also had really good stuff and found success right away. But then had a UCL injury, and ever since then he's been a little bit more inconsistent. So this year, 4.95 ERA, 4.15 expected ERA, 5.04 FIP. I don't think Griffin Canning is particularly good, so I don't really want to roster him in this spot. There's other pitchers that I'd rather get to, but I'm not really dying to stack the Orioles against him either.
Yeah, I'm not really in love with the Orioles here. One thing I will point out for Canning that does work in his favor, especially, for example, if you were looking to pivot off Sonny Gray in this price range, huge difference in his strikeout numbers against righties and lefties, 27.5% strikeout percentage against righties this year. That's always something I think is interesting against the Orioles, because when you think about the good hitters in the Orioles lineup, of course you have Cedric Mullins from the left side, Santander lefty, or switch hitter, but Mancini, Mountcastle, Hayes, the three guys in the middle of the order that are likely to do damage, all right-handed. So that sets up well for Canning. One concern for Canning is that he has the fifth highest drop in fastball spin rate since June 6th out of all the pitchers I looked at. His breaking ball spin rate is down as well. It hasn't been reflected so far in his called strike plus swinging strike, or just his results in general. But I do think that it's worth noting that he's up there with the Trevor Bauers of the world in terms of drop in spin rate since June 6th.
That is definitely interesting. I hadn't thought to look at his individual numbers just because it wasn't a pitcher I was really considering today. So I've looked a little deeper into the pitchers that I'm kind of considering stacking against. That's noted. Maybe out of 150 lineups, that would encourage me to play like 2% Orioles, 3% Orioles, or something like that. So maybe not an entire fade, but still not a high priority for me. Next game we have here, San Francisco Giants in Arizona. The Arizona Diamondbacks, really just a historically bad team this year, impressively bad, especially as of late. Alex Wood going up against Zach Gallen. Gallen has pitched, fairly well this year, sparked a little upside, but I haven't really liked to pick on the Giants offense this year much. They have been surprisingly decent. So to me, Zach Gallen, good enough where I don't think I'm going to want to stack the Giants in this spot, but I don't really want to roster him either. Alex Wood, I'm a little more inclined to get to just because of how bad the Diamondbacks offense is.
Yeah, I think that's fair. The other thing too for Gallen, I love Zach Gallen as a pitcher, but he's another one where so far this year he struck out 33% of righties compared to 21% of lefties. If you go back to last year, he was at 33% of righties, 23% of lefties. This Giants lineup, you have Wade, Yastrzemski, Dickerson, Crawford, probably four of the top five hitters hitting left-handed. So it doesn't really set up as the best strikeout matchup for Zach Gallen in terms of what he typically can do as well. I do think he's a good pitcher. He's typically able to, limit damage, not giving up really any power to lefties this year. So I'm not looking to go to the Giants, like you said. As far as Alex Wood goes, I hate rostering Alex Wood, but the Diamondbacks are pretty bad. Wood, as far as being stretched out, he threw 92 pitches last start. We've seen him throw 100 pitches twice in his last 10 starts, but typically can give you like 90 to 100 pitches. Reasonable price tag. I think Wood is at 8,500. I don't have any issues with Alex Wood.
And then offense, is any interest for you in either of them?
Not really. I'm just not looking to pick on Zach Gallen, and the Diamondbacks don't really have anything to use against Alex Wood.
All right, next game here, Eduardo Rodriguez and the Boston Red Sox taking on the Oakland A's. I'm kind of surprised to see Eduardo Rodriguez pick up ownership today because this is the spot that typically the field does not roster that I like to go to as a lone spot, because Eduardo Rodriguez this year has really good looking underlying stats. The problem is the run prevention hasn't been good from a real life perspective. So 5.83 ERA, but look at the underlying numbers, 3.38 expected ERA, 3.58 FIP, his strikeout numbers, 27.4%. That is the highest of his career. His walk rate, 5.6%. That is the lowest of his career. So it's very odd to see somebody with their best career strikeout rate, their lowest career walk rate, also posting their worst career ERA. So I think things are going to turn around for Eduardo Rodriguez sooner rather than later. The spot against the A's is far from ideal. But with that said, just because his underlying stats are so out of line with his ERA, I think his ownership is going to come down later in the day. I don't really think the field is going to be on him that heavy. And as long as that's the case, I actually really like Eduardo Rodriguez as an SP2.
I think I actually like him more than Sonny Gray at this price point, unless we get word that Sonny Gray isn't limited. But again, going under the assumption that Gray is going to give us like 70 to 80 pitches, I would rather go to Rodriguez here, knowing that if he pitches well, he'll throw 90 to 100 pitches. It's another like 60-degree day, it looks like, in Oakland. Favorable park for pitchers in general, favorable pitching weather. Rodriguez, not the same strikeout percentage this year as Gray, but not that far behind. He's at 27.5%, 3.38 xFIP, like you said, much better than his 5.83 ERA. The A's are a tough matchup, no doubt about it, but Rodriguez has always been able to strike out right-handed hitters as well. This season, no exception, with a 27.2% strikeout percentage against righties. Again, unless we get word that Gray is not going to be limited, I think the slight edge goes to Rodriguez just based on the ceiling.
And then on the other side, Frankie Montas, he's had some good results this year, but, I've really liked to roster pitchers against the Boston Red Sox. So Frankie Montas at his price point, not somebody I'm really dying to get to, but probably good enough that I don't really want to roster the Red Sox against him, especially in a favorable pitcher's park. So any interest in Montas or Boston for you?
No, not really interested in either side. Montas is a pitcher that I think is pretty decent. His strikeout numbers, or his numbers in general, are much, much better against lefties because he's got the splitter that he throws 26% of the time to lefties. He only throws it 7% of the time to righties, kind of like Kevin Gausman when he was with the Orioles. Has a really good pitch and just thinks he can only throw it to half of the hitters that he faces. But that, does drive down his overall strikeout percentage. And when you talk about a team like the Red Sox, they're going to have a lot of right-handed bats in this lineup, which actually does not help Montas's upside. So not a spot where I'm really looking to pick on Montas. He still does a good job keeping the ball on the ground. And it's not, really good hitting conditions, but I'm also not looking to roster him.
All right. Final game on the slate, finally down the stretch here, guys. If you haven't done it yet, definitely please subscribe to the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, also like the video, because listen, Adam and I, we've been here talking about 80 million baseball games today. Lots of pitchers to go through, lots of hitters, and finally down the stretch here, Kyle Gibson versus Logan Gilbert. Talk to me about Kyle Gibson a little bit, because he has been shockingly good this year. A guy who's basically had zero success over the last couple of years, 4.84 ERA, 5.35 ERA over the last years, also poor underlying numbers. All of a sudden this year, 2.0 ERA, 3.28 expected ERA. Still, though, not all that favorable of a fantasy pitcher because the strikeout numbers haven't been there. So what do you make of Kyle Gibson today? And then going forward, is he just a good pitcher now?
He's always been a pitcher that I thought should be better than he was because he's got good breaking stuff. He just kind of didn't throw it enough. He throws his sinker, which gets hit and doesn't miss any bats. The guy this year against right-handed bats has a 25% swinging strike percentage on his slider, but he still throws his sinker 44% of the time and has an 8.9% swinging strike percentage. If he would just flip those numbers, his strikeout percentage would just skyrocket. He'd be a great fantasy option, but that hasn't been the case. And so you're getting a guy that's still decent at preventing runs, but like you said, not a great fantasy pitcher because he only has a 20% strikeout percentage because for whatever reason, pitching coaches in baseball don't know how to fix their pitchers. So it makes it really tough. Like the matchup against Seattle is good, but I just have trouble looking to Gibson when you have guys at this price point. Eduardo Rodriguez, who we know is fully stretched out with a 27% strikeout percentage. Sonny Gray, who knows how many pitches he's going to throw, but has a 30% strikeout percentage. It's just tough for me to get to someone like Gibson given his strikeout numbers.
Yeah, it's hard to really see realistic upside unless he's just going to be, super efficient with his pitch count and end up pitching, 8 or 9 innings or something like that. And maybe that enables him to get to those 6 or 7 strikeouts and get the extra outs. But I agree, not somebody who worked into my player pool in my initial build. On the other side, Logan Gilbert, he's been pretty mediocre for the year, 4.25 ERA, 4.17 expected ERA. Matchup against the Rangers, also neutral. I'm seeing people in the chat already bring up Joey Gallo's been on fire. I never mind Joey Gallo as a one-off. Nate Lowe, also somebody who had a 2-homer game recently. So any interest in the Rangers to stack for you? I will lead by saying not for me. Definitely a massive park downgrade for them. And then the other thing also is just that, Logan Gilbert's okay.
Yeah, I'm not really interested in them as a full stack. I'm more interested in grabbing some one-offs. I think you can look to Gallo for sure at 3,900. Nate Lowe at 4K is fine. David Dahl, if he's in the lineup at 2K, is, I think, a pretty good option against Gilbert. But yeah, Gilbert's been fine this year. 22.8% strikeout percentage against lefties, 30.4% against righties, 172 expected ISO to lefties, 252 to righties. So, I mean, I guess those power numbers to righties, you could look to like Adolis Garcia as well. But yeah, again, I think I'm just more interested in grabbing like, one-offs here. I will say, I think I would rather go to Logan Gilbert if I'm going. I'd rather go to Logan Gilbert than Brady Singer in these mid 6K guys.
Yeah, I mean, that's reasonable enough. Logan Gilbert has had a little bit more success this year. He does have a 26.2% strikeout rate. It's also a much easier matchup. So I don't mind it, although I think ultimately I'm probably not going to get to either much, if at any, by the time the lamps go around. But I do think that is a reasonable take. But hey, we've done it. We've ran the gamut. That is all 14 games, guys. Thank you very much for sticking around and watching to the end. Like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Also, if you have not done so already, head on over to PrizePicks, the sponsor of our show. Use the promo code Awesemo, get a $100 bonus on your first deposit. And that'll do it for us. Tyler, you can play the music out. Have a good day, guys.